In the highlands of ancient Peru, a wild, pea-sized berry grew among the weeds, bitter, unassuming, and utterly unremarkable. No one could have guessed that this small fruit would one day become the most consumed vegetable on earth, ignite accusations of witchcraft, fuel the fortunes of empires, and give birth to the defining flavor of Italian cuisine, a cuisine that for most of its history had never seen a single tomato. This is the story of the tomato, a fruit mistaken for poison, banned by aristocrats, worshipped by peasants, fought over in courtrooms, and eventually crowned the king of the kitchen. Long before Columbus, long before Rome, long before written history in the Americas, a small yellow berry crept along the coastal deserts of what is now Peru and Ecuador. It was tart, tiny, barely larger than a modern blueberry, and mostly ignored by early civilizations who had richer, more abundant crops to cultivate, maize, potatoes, beans, but the wild tomato did not stay wild forever. As it spread northward into Mesoamerica over centuries, likely carried by birds and traders alike, it found its way into the hands of the Aztecs, who transformed it completely. Through generations of careful selection, choosing the largest, sweetest, most productive plants to replant each season, they bred the small bitter berry into something larger, juicier, and far more versatile. They called it Tomatina, meaning the swelling fruit, the origin of the word we use today. By the time Spanish conquistadors arrived in the early 16th century, the tomato was already deeply woven into Aztec life. It was chopped with chili peppers and ground squash seeds into sauces resembling an early salsa. It was sold in vibrant colors, red, yellow, even green, in the bustling markets of Tenochtitlan alongside maize, cacao, and beans. Spanish chroniclers of the time even documented tomato vendors in their writings, describing an entire marketplace built around this one small fruit. It was, in every sense, already a staple, just one the rest of the world had never seen. When Spanish explorers carried the tomato back across the Atlantic in the 1520s, they unknowingly delivered one of history's great ironies. A food that would eventually define Mediterranean cuisine arrived in Europe under deep suspicion of being poisonous. The reason lay in botany, not folklore. The tomato belongs to the nightshade family, the same family as belladonna, mandrake, and henbane. Plants genuinely capable of killing. European botanists, cautious by necessity, classified the tomato alongside its toxic relatives and treated it as an ornamental curiosity rather than food. Wealthy Europeans grew tomato plants in ornamental gardens to admire their strange star-shaped flowers, not to eat their fruit. There was also a very literal danger, though not from the fruit itself. European aristocrats ate from pewter plates high in lead content. The tomato's natural acidity leached lead from the plate into the food, and diners who indulged sometimes fell ill or died. The tomato was blamed. It earned a grim nickname in some circles, the poison apple. In France and parts of Northern Europe, it also picked up a more romantic name, the love apple, thanks to a belief, entirely unproven, that it acted as an aphrodisiac. For nearly 2 centuries, the tomato lived in Europe as a suspicious houseplant, admired from a distance, occasionally feared, occasionally romanticized, while peasant communities in Spain and southern Italy, who couldn't afford pewter and ate from wooden or clay plates, quietly discovered there was nothing to fear at all. It was in southern Italy, among people with far less to lose and far less patience for aristocratic superstition, that the tomato found its true home. By the late 1600s, Italian cooks, particularly in Naples, then a Spanish territory, began experimenting with the fruit in earnest. The first known tomato recipes appeared in a Neapolitan cookbook in 1692, pairing tomato with squash and eggplant in dishes that clearly showed Spanish and New World influence. From there, the tomato crept steadily into the Italian pantry. It found its way onto flatbreads sold by street vendors in Naples' poorer neighborhoods, early humble ancestors of what the world would eventually call pizza. These were peasant foods, sold cheaply on the street, eaten standing up, centuries before pizza became a global phenomenon. Yet even in Italy, transformation was gradual. It would take until the 19th century for tomato sauce to become the celebrated cornerstone of Italian cooking that we recognize today. Industrialization played a critical role. Canning technology, developed in the early 1800s and refined throughout the century, allowed tomatoes to be preserved and shipped far beyond their growing season, turning a regional, seasonal ingredient into a year-round pantry staple. By the time Italian immigrants began arriving in the United States in massive waves during the late 1800s and early 1900s, tomato sauce wasn't just food. It was identity, memory, and home, carried across an ocean in the form of a recipe passed from grandmother to daughter. The tomato's identity crisis wasn't only culinary, it was legal. In 1893, the question of whether a tomato was a fruit or a vegetable landed before the United States Supreme Court. Botanically, the tomato is unquestionably a fruit. It develops from the flower and contains seeds. But the case wasn't about botany, it was about tariffs. Under U.S. law at the time, imported vegetables were taxed, while fruits were not. An importer argued tomatoes were fruit and should be tax-exempt, and took his case all the way to the nation's highest court. The Supreme Court disagreed, not on scientific grounds, but on culinary custom. The court ruled that because tomatoes were grown in kitchen gardens, served as part of the main meal rather than as dessert, and prepared the way vegetables typically were, they would be classified as vegetables for the purposes of trade and taxation. The opinion acknowledged the botanical truth outright, and ruled against it anyway, siding with how ordinary people actually spoke and ate. The ruling had no effect on biology, but it permanently shaped how English-speaking countries would talk about the tomato ever after, a fruit legally reclassified by the language of the dinner table. The 20th century turned the tomato from a beloved regional ingredient into a global industry. Plant breeders developed hardier, more uniform varieties suited to mechanical harvesting. In the 1940s and 50s, agricultural researchers engineered tomatoes tough enough to survive being picked by machine and shipped thousands of miles without bruising. This innovation came with real trade-offs. Flavor, prized by home cooks for centuries, was often sacrificed for durability and shelf life. The supermarket tomato, picked green and ripened artificially with ethylene gas during transport, became a symbol, for critics, of everything industrial agriculture had gained in efficiency and lost in taste. Food writers of the late 20th century would go on to mourn this trade-off in essays and documentaries, sparking an heirloom tomato revival that continues in farmers' markets today. At the same time, tomato-based products exploded in popularity worldwide. Ketchup, first commercially bottled in the United States in the 1870s, became a staple condiment on nearly every table in the Western world. Canned tomato sauce and paste became pantry essentials from Naples to New Jersey to New Delhi. What began as a suspicious garden ornament had become one of the most economically significant crops on the planet, with global production eventually reaching hundreds of millions of tons annually. Nowhere is the tomato's cultural transformation more visible than in the Spanish town of Bull, where every August since 1945, tens of thousands of people gather for La Tomatina, a festival in which participants throw over 100 tons of ripe tomatoes at one another in the streets. What began, according to local legend, as a spontaneous food fight among young people has become one of the most famous food festivals on Earth. A fruit once feared as poison now celebrated as pure, joyful excess. Similar reverence appears globally in different forms. Italy holds countless tomato festivals in small towns each summer. India uses the tomato as a foundation for curries across nearly every regional cuisine. And in the American Midwest, home canning traditions continue, families still preserving summer's tomato harvest in mason jars, a practice passed down for generations. Today, the tomato is grown on every inhabited continent and consumed in nearly every cuisine on Earth. China leads the world in tomato production, followed by India, Turkey, and the United States. It appears in Indian curries, Middle Eastern stews, Mexican salsas, and of course Italian sauces, having completed a journey that began in the wild hills of Peru and passed through Aztec markets, European suspicion, Neapolitan kitchens, American courtrooms, Spanish streets, and industrial farms. There is a quiet irony worth sitting with. The very cuisine most associated with the tomato in the modern imagination, Italian cooking, spent centuries without it at all. Pasta pomodoro, margherita pizza, the deep red sauces simmering in trattorias across the world are, historically speaking, newcomers. Traditions we assume to be ancient are often only a few hundred years old. The tomato's journey is a reminder that the foods we consider timeless are rarely timeless at all. They are shaped by trade routes and empires, by superstition and science, by court rulings and street festivals, by kitchen experiments passed down through generations. Small fruits carried across oceans, transformed again and again by the people who dared to taste them. From a bitter wild berry in the Andes to the defining flavor of pizza, pasta, curry, and ketchup, the tomato story is proof that even the most humble ingredients carry centuries of history in every single bite.